The crisp scent of roasted chestnuts and mulled cider drifted through the autumn air as crowds laughed and music danced from the main stage of the harvest fair. Children darted between hay bales, their cheeks flushed from the cold, while parents browsed stalls lined with hand-knit scarves and steaming pies. But for Oliver Hartwell, the world had narrowed to one sickening realization. His little girl was gone. "Lily!" His voice cut through the noise, sharp and frantic. Only moments earlier she had been at his side, holding her threadbare rabbit toy in one hand, her white dress catching the golden light. He had bent to tie his shoe, and when he looked up, she had vanished. Panic slammed into him. He pushed through the crowd, muttering apologies as he checked behind stalls, scanned benches, and peered around the cider stand. The festival had been his first attempt to coax Lily back into the world since her mother, Emily, had died months earlier. She hadn't spoken since the funeral. Not a word, not a laugh, not even a cry. She just clung to that toy rabbit and kept her eyes down, as though she no longer trusted the world to hold her safely. Today was meant to be a step forward. Now it felt like the ground had given way beneath him. Then, at the edge of the orchard, something caught Oliver's eye, a patch of stillness under a great maple tree. There, sitting on a faded blanket, was a young woman he had never seen before, her long golden hair in a loose braid. In her lap, resting quietly, was Lily, not crying, not trembling, but leaning against the stranger's shoulder. And the woman was singing. Oliver froze. That melody, no, it couldn't be. It was Emily's lullaby, the one she had made up herself, a private ritual between mother and daughter. It had never been recorded, never written down. No one else knew it. Yet this woman sang it with aching precision, her voice soft and a little rough around the edges, like a record worn by love. He moved closer, his heart hammering. Since Emily's death, Lily recoiled from every stranger's touch, shrinking even from well-meaning neighbors. Yet here she was, curled into this unknown woman's arms as though she belonged there. When their eyes met, the woman gave the smallest nod, unafraid. "I'm her father," Oliver said, his voice tight. The stranger, who would later introduce herself as Grace Ellison, simply stroked Lily's back and said gently, "She was lost. I just sat down and she came to me." Oliver's gaze flicked between his daughter and the woman who somehow knew the one song he thought was gone forever. He didn't understand it yet, but in that moment he sensed something was shifting, quietly, impossibly, and that neither of their lives would ever be quite the same again. Oliver stayed crouched beside them, his eyes fixed on Grace. "That song. How do you know it?" His voice was more demand than question, sharpened by disbelief. Grace's lips parted, but no answer came. She glanced down at Lily, still curled against her, the little girl's small hand tangled in the sleeve of her cardigan. "I just thought it might help," she murmured, as though admitting something fragile. Oliver's chest tightened. "You sang it perfectly. My wife, Emily, made that lullaby up. She only ever sang it to Lily. She never shared it with anyone." The words felt heavier out loud, like speaking them made Emily's absence more real. Grace hesitated, her green eyes flicking up to his, and he saw something raw there. Not guilt, not fear, but a quiet kind of sorrow. She took a slow breath before speaking. "I heard it once, a long time ago, in a short video online. Just a mother singing to her baby. I didn't know who she was. I only saw it once." Oliver's mind reeled. He remembered now. Years ago, Emily had let a friend record a tiny clip, maybe 20 seconds long, singing that lullaby to Lily. It had been posted anonymously on a parenting blog, quickly forgotten. He hadn't thought about it in years. Yet here was this stranger who had memorized it so perfectly that it could pull Lily, his silent, guarded little girl, into her arms. Grace's voice softened further as she went on. "I was in an accident when I was 21. A drunk driver ran a red light. I was in hospital for weeks. My vocal cords were damaged. I couldn't speak for 5 years. She paused, looking away. When I started trying again, I needed something to follow. The sound, the rhythm, the emotion. That video, your wife's voice, it was the first one I could match. It helped me find my way back." Her voice cracked on the last word. Oliver didn't know what to say. His instinct, sharp from years of boardroom negotiations, told him she wasn't lying. She had no reason to. And yet it felt impossible that Emily's voice had bridged the years and found this woman. Before he could process it further, Lily stirred. She turned her face towards Grace, then reached out and took Oliver's hand without letting go of Grace's. And there, between them, Oliver saw something he hadn't dared hope for, calm in Lily's eyes. Over the next week, their paths crossed again, not by accident this time. Oliver invited Grace to visit. The first time, Lily sat close but silent. By the second, she was offering her drawings, wobbly crayon figures of 3 people standing in a garden, a tall man, a small girl, and a woman with yellow hair. Grace never made a fuss over them, just smiled and encouraged her to add more. On the 4th visit, Oliver caught something new, a faint hum from Lily as Grace read to her. She still didn't speak, but the silence no longer felt like a locked door, more like a pause before a note. Grace never pushed. She communicated with gestures, expressions, and gentle tones. Sometimes they'd sit side by side in quiet, Grace flipping through picture books while Lily colored. Sometimes she'd hum that lullaby, almost under her breath, while Lily leaned against her. Oliver found himself standing in doorways, just watching. There was something about Grace's patience, the way she occupied a moment without forcing it forward, that reminded him of Emily in her softest moods. One afternoon, Lily woke from a nightmare. Oliver was halfway down the hall when he heard muffled sobs, but by the time he reached the living room, Grace was already there, kneeling beside the couch. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered, taking Lily's hand and pressing it lightly to her own chest. "Feel that? That's my heartbeat. It means I'm here. You're not alone." Lily hiccuped, then mirrored the gesture, placing Grace's hand over her own heart. Oliver stood frozen in the doorway, something stirring deep in him. For the first time since Emily's death, hope didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like possibility. That evening, after Grace left, Oliver found Lily's sketchbook on the table. He flipped through the pages until one made him pause. It wasn't like her earlier garden drawings. This one showed 2 women standing side by side, one with long dark hair, the other with yellow. He knew instantly who they were meant to be. Emily and Grace, drawn as though they were friends. He stared at it for a long time, torn between the sharp ache of loss and the strange warmth of seeing Grace in a place Emily once filled. It was too soon, far too soon, to think of another woman stepping into their lives in any formal way. But this picture wasn't about him. It was Lily's voice on paper. And Lily, in her own quiet way, had already decided Grace belonged. That night, sleep was elusive. The house was silent, but not in the oppressive way it had been since Emily died. This silence felt like it was listening. Restless, Oliver stepped outside into the garden, still holding the sketchbook. The moon was high, spilling pale light across the lawn. Then faintly he heard it, a melody so soft it almost melted into the night air. He followed the sound to the bench beneath the old willow tree. Grace sat there alone, her face tilted slightly upward, eyes closed. She was singing Emily's lullaby, not loudly enough for anyone but herself to hear. Her voice cracked here and there, the notes trembling as though unsure of their right to exist. Yet the emotion behind them was raw and unguarded. Oliver realized with a quiet jolt. She wasn't singing for Lily this time. She was singing for herself, for the young woman who had once lost her voice entirely, for the years she had spent in silence, for the song that had pulled her back into the world. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there listening. For so long his grief had sat inside him like an immovable stone, cold and unyielding. But watching Grace now, he felt something shift. She had rebuilt her voice from the ruins of her past, note by note, and that quiet resilience reached a part of him he hadn't known was still alive. When she finally opened her eyes and noticed him, she didn't speak. She just offered a small, slightly embarrassed smile. He returned it, then glanced down at the sketchbook in his hand. Stepping forward, he held it out. "Lily drew this today," he said quietly. "She put you next to her mum." Grace's breath caught as she took the drawing. "She doesn't draw people unless they matter," Oliver added, his voice low. Grace blinked rapidly, her eyes shining, though she quickly looked away toward the moon. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me stay." Oliver didn't reply. Instead, he sat down beside her. They stayed like that for a long time, neither speaking, neither needing to. The air between them was full, not of words, but of everything they couldn't yet say. It had been weeks since the day at the festival, and Grace's presence had woven itself quietly into their lives. Not constant, but natural. That night, however, Oliver wanted to show her something he hadn't shared with anyone since Emily's death. He led her inside, past the family photos he still couldn't bear to take down, to his study. From a locked cabinet, he pulled out an old external drive. When the file loaded, Grace's eyes widened. The video was shaky, filmed years ago in Lily's nursery. Emily was barefoot, cradling baby Lily as she sang the lullaby. Her voice was warm and unpolished, swaying gently with her daughter in her arms. "Just in case I'm not around someday," Emily had joked back then. Oliver had brushed it off at the time. Now every frame was a lifeline. When the song ended, Grace's voice was barely audible. "That was it. That's the video. I watched it every night for months when I couldn't speak. Not for the words, for the way she held her." Oliver felt something tighten in his chest as she went on. "Your wife taught me how to speak even when I had no voice." He didn't know what to say, so he didn't. He simply reached across the small space between them, took her hand gently, and let the silence speak for them both. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so gentle it almost went unnoticed. Oliver found himself thinking less about what had been lost and more about what was quietly growing. Grief still lingered in the corners, but it no longer commanded every room. Much of that was because of Grace. Though she never pushed herself into their space, she seemed to instinctively know when to step closer and when to let silence do the talking. It began with Lily. Her smiles came easier now, her drawings brighter. One morning, as Oliver was pouring his coffee, Lily's soft voice broke the stillness. "Grace," she whispered. Just one word, barely more than a breath, but Oliver froze mid-pour. It was the first time his daughter had spoken since Emily's death. He turned toward her, hardly daring to move. Grace, seated cross-legged on the floor beside Lily, didn't react with surprise. Instead, she simply smiled, as though she'd been waiting for this moment all along. That afternoon, Lily handed Oliver a drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Above them, in blocky, uneven letters, she had written, "Grace = happy." Oliver's throat tightened, but he managed to smile. That evening, the 3 of them baked biscuits together. Flour dusted their hair, chocolate smudged Lily's chin, and for the first time in a long while, the kitchen was filled with laughter instead of silence. Weekends brought new traditions. They planted herbs in terracotta pots by the porch, Lily happily digging with dirt under her fingernails while Grace whispered to the seedlings like they were old friends. Oliver watched them from across the garden, his hands busy but his thoughts quietly unsettled. He didn't know what name to give this thing growing between them, this mix of comfort, trust, and something warmer he didn't dare acknowledge aloud. One morning, as Grace reached for a planter, she caught her hand on its sharp edge. She brushed it off, but before she could move, Oliver was beside her, already unwrapping the first aid kit. His touch was careful, his hands steady as he cleaned and dressed the wound. Grace watched him silently, startled by the tenderness. He didn't say much, but there was something in the way he looked at her. Not pity, not obligation, just quiet care. Later that evening, Lily left a folded drawing at Grace's place at the table, 3 crayon hearts. One was labeled Voice Angel. Grace pressed it to her chest, her eyes closed for a moment longer than she intended. But feelings, no matter how carefully they're tended, eventually look for a name. One afternoon at the park, as they packed away the remnants of a picnic, Grace knelt to tie her shoe. The knot slipped. Before she could try again, Oliver was there, crouched beside her. "Let me," he murmured. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately. When he looked up, their eyes met. It lasted only a heartbeat, but something passed between them, something unspoken, something that made the air feel thinner. Grace's lips parted, her breath catching as the words trembled at the edge of her voice. "I think I But she stopped. The fear crept in, not of Oliver, not of what she felt, but of losing the one thing she had fought so hard to reclaim, her voice. To name it might be to risk it. So instead of finishing, she stood abruptly, brushing at imaginary dust on her jeans. "I should go," she whispered. Oliver didn't move. Still kneeling, he watched her walk away, the late sunlight turning her hair to gold. He wondered then if love sometimes lived best between the words, waiting quietly for the courage to be spoken. In the days that followed, Oliver noticed the first signs: a faint croak at the end of Grace's sentences, a hesitation before speaking. She dismissed it as tiredness, but the truth revealed itself quickly. Within a week her voice was gone. No sound, no whisper, nothing. The fragile thread she had once fought years to recover had unraveled again, and with it came the quiet terror she had never confessed to anyone. She stopped visiting, stopped answering messages, stopped coming to the garden where Lily once held her hand. The absence was like a light going out. At first Oliver respected the space, but when Lily began sitting on the porch every day asking softly, "Where's Grace?" he knew space was no longer kindness. It was a wall that needed breaking. The rain was light but steady when Oliver reached Grace's flat, his coat damp along the shoulders. The building manager recognized him instantly and let him in without question. He knocked once, then again, and for a long moment there was nothing, just the muted patter of rain against the corridor windows. Then the door creaked open. Grace stood there, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her eyes rimmed red. She looked smaller than he remembered, as though the silence had carved pieces from her. Oliver didn't ask why she'd vanished. He didn't demand explanations. He simply held her gaze until she stepped back, allowing him inside. The flat was dim, heavy with stillness. The piano sat closed, its polished lid gathering dust. Torn pieces of sheet music lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. On the coffee table, an open notepad rested with words written in looping, careful script. Grace picked it up, hesitated, then slid it across to him. "I didn't need to speak to fall in love with you." Oliver's breath caught. He looked from the page to her face, but her eyes were lowered, her shoulders trembling once, almost imperceptibly. The silence between them was thick, but it didn't feel empty. He set the notepad down, crossed the small space, and sat beside her. Then, without a word, he wrapped his arms around her. She didn't resist. Instead, she folded into him, her body curving into his like a memory finding its place. He didn't try to fix the silence or fill it with promises. He simply held her, steady and certain, the way you hold something fragile but worth keeping. A month passed before her voice began to return, not in some dramatic rush, but as a shy, hesitant visitor. A few words one day, a half sentence the next. Oliver didn't push. Every few days he left small tokens at her door, a daisy taped to her letterbox, a favorite book with a note tucked inside, a paper bag of biscuits from the bakery she loved. He never asked her to speak. His message was always the same: "I still hear you, even if you can't say anything yet." When her text finally came, "I'd like to see you and Lily," his reply was immediate. "Come Saturday. Lily's favorite spot. We'll bring sandwiches. You bring your smile." That weekend, the sky was a clear, endless blue. Oliver spread a blanket under the willow tree while Lily arranged juice boxes and biscuits from a wicker basket. The moment she saw Grace walking towards them, Lily leapt up and ran, her arms flung wide, her face alight, and when she reached Grace, she wrapped herself around her waist and whispered something that made Oliver freeze where he stood. "Mummy says thank you for singing to me." It was the first full sentence Lily had spoken since Emily's death. Grace's knees buckled as she crouched down to hold the little girl. Her hands trembled, her eyes brimming. She pressed her cheek to Lily's hair, closing her eyes as if to memorize the feel of her in her arms. It wasn't just a child's words. It was the bridge that finally spanned all the silences they had carried: Oliver's grief, Lily's trauma, Grace's fear. When the sun began to dip and the meadow turned gold, Oliver reached into the basket and drew out a small velvet box. He handed it to Lily, who opened it with delicate fingers. Inside were 2 simple leather bracelets, each engraved with the same words: "You found her when I was lost, and you found me too." Lily turned to Grace with a solemn nod, slipping one bracelet onto her wrist before putting the other on her own. The gesture was quiet but full, as if she'd passed something sacred from her heart to Grace's. Oliver stepped forward then, taking Grace's hand. He turned it gently, fastening the bracelet more securely, and before letting go, he brought her palm to rest flat against his chest. No one spoke. No one needed to. In that silent moment, without vows, without declarations, the next chapter of their story began, written in the language they both understood best: presence. The following year unfolded like a quiet, steady sunrise. No grand declarations, no dramatic turns, only the gradual weaving together of lives once frayed by grief and silence. On the corner of Elm and 13th, a once abandoned building now glowed warmly in the evening light, transformed into a haven of music and healing. The sign above its door read "The Voice Within," but to those who stepped inside it was far more than a center. It was sanctuary. Soft melodies floated through the air, some hummed by shy children still learning to trust their own voices. Others tapped out on small drums or plucked gently on handmade instruments. Lucas and Hannah stood side by side, their eyes fixed on Ivy, who now moved confidently through the room, guiding a younger student through a breathing exercise. Her hair was longer now, tied in a loose braid just like Hannah's, and her smile, once rare and fleeting, lingered easily on her face. She was thriving not because her world was perfect, but because the silence that once trapped her had been replaced with connection, care, and courage. The center had grown slowly, not through glossy adverts or big investors, but through the quiet whispers of parents whose once silent children had found their voices here. It wasn't therapy in the cold, clinical sense. It was a place where no one had to justify why their voice cracked mid-sentence, or why some days they didn't speak at all. It was a home for stories, for patience, for the belief that silence is not the absence of communication, but a language in itself. That evening, the center's opening celebration was strung with lights that twinkled like a sky full of stars. Families sat on soft cushions, laughter and murmurs filling the air. Hannah stepped forward, microphone in hand, though she hardly needed it anymore. Her voice, once stolen and feared lost forever, was now steady and sure, and the room leaned into it. "I'd like to invite someone very special," she said, softly, her eyes warm. "The girl who taught me that even silence has its own music." Ivy bounded onto the platform, her small hand finding Hannah's. The room stilled, breath collectively held, and then Ivy began to sing. It was Emma's lullaby, the same melody that had once existed only in memory and an anonymous video, but now it rose as a duet, Ivy's young voice meeting Hannah's in the middle of every note. It wasn't perfect in pitch, but it was perfect in truth. A bridge between a mother and a daughter, a teacher and a student, the past and the future. By the time the final note faded, no one clapped immediately. They were too busy feeling the weight of it, swallowing their tears and holding on to the moment. And when the applause finally came, it wasn't just for the song, it was for the journey. Later, as the guests mingled and the lights glowed softer, Lucas found Hannah in a quiet corner. He thanked her, not in the casual way people say thanks, but with the kind of depth that comes from knowing someone has altered the course of your life. She didn't answer straight away. Instead, she handed him a copy of her newly published book, The Voice That Found Me. Inside, the dedication read, "To Ivy, to Emma, and to the man who listened even when I couldn't speak." Lucas ran a thumb along the spine before meeting her eyes, and in that look there was no need for further explanation. Later still, the three of them sat in the garden behind the center as paper lanterns floated into the twilight. Ivy rested against Hannah's arm and whispered, "Now I have two voices, Mummy's lullaby and Hannah's heart." Neither Lucas nor Hannah replied. They didn't need to. The silence that wrapped around them was no longer the silence of loss. It was the silence of home, of love, of a family that had chosen each other. If you'd like, I can now write the final emotional closing and life lesson for this story so it feels complete and ready for publishing. That way, it ties perfectly into a call for comments and subscriptions like in the original format. Would you like me to do that next? In the weeks that followed, the connection between Daniel, Grace, and little Sophie deepened in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. What had started as a chance meeting beneath the maple tree at the harvest fair began to take on the shape of something far more enduring. Sophie, once a silent and withdrawn child since the loss of her mother, now sought out Grace's company with a trust that surprised even Daniel. She would draw pictures, 3 figures standing together, always the same, and place them on Grace's lap without a word, her small smile speaking volumes. Grace never forced conversations or pressed Sophie to speak. Instead, she communicated through gentle presence, shared activities, and the soothing rhythm of her voice when she read stories or hummed softly. There was a calmness about her, a patience Daniel hadn't realized he'd been yearning for. Grace's understanding seemed to reach into the quiet corners of his daughter's grief, and in doing so, touched his own. The first time Sophie whispered Grace's name, Daniel had felt something inside him crack open, a mix of gratitude, disbelief, and a fragile hope he hadn't dared to hold for months. Evenings at home began to shift, less silence, more laughter, the air lighter somehow. On weekends, they tended to a small herb garden together, Sophie digging in the soil while Grace whispered to the seedlings as if coaxing them to grow. Daniel found himself lingering in these moments, watching them both, his hands busy but his heart slowly unfreezing. There was no rush, no expectation, just the steady weaving of lives through simple acts of care. But with the closeness came an unspoken truth that hovered between them, too tender yet to name. Daniel could see the way Grace's eyes softened when she looked at Sophie, and sometimes at him, as though she was silently asking for permission to belong. And in his quiet way, he was already giving it. What neither of them knew was that life would soon test this fragile bond, forcing them to face the fear of losing it before they had even had the chance to claim it fully. But for now, beneath the soft glow of an early evening sky, with the sound of Sophie's humming and Grace's patient laughter filling the air, Daniel allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that healing wasn't only possible, it was already happening.